All right, so we've talked about water quality, we've talked about chemistry, we've talked about quantity, we've talked about all the things that set you up to actually start treating water. So what this pre-lecture is going to do for you today is hopefully give you an idea of the basics of water treatment, and then we're going to dive into these specific unit processes and operations throughout the rest of the semester, specifically looking at water treatment before spring break. So, in basic water treatment, unit processes are generally classified as either physical, chemical, or biological based on what they're doing. So, physical unit processes we normally call unit operations, and then chemical and biological processes are normally called unit processes. So, just a little bit of terminology. Your book uses this terminology if you're reading through it. It's just a different way to differentiate the two of these. So these unit processes can be used for both drinking water and wastewater. So some of them are going to be specific to the contaminant that you're looking at or the impurity you're looking at, and some of them are going to be specific to water and wastewater because there's different characteristics between the two. So if you want to make yourself a list, physical processes are things like sedimentation, flotation, or granular bed filtration. So we're not adding chemicals and we're not using biology. We're just using gravity. We're using sand. We're using air. So no chemical addition. So physical things, sedimentation, flotation, granular bed filtration. For unit processes, chemical and biological, some of the things that we can see are things like coagulation, flocculation, carbon adsorption, ion exchange, chlorination, activated sludge, aerobic digestion, and anaerobic digestion. So there's a lot more when it comes to unit processes. We've gotten pretty good at chemistry and biology over the course of human evolution, so we've developed some really interesting processes. So those are some to be aware of, and we'll talk about each of those in class. One key thing when it comes to water treatment is the degree that you have to treat your water to depends on a couple things. So it depends on the raw or the source water quality, and that's found through water system sampling lab studies. So like for example, the Metropolitan Utilities District in Omaha will have staff specifically who go out and sample their source water so that they know what's in it. So that's how that's done. And then the degree of quality of the finished water also comes into play. So we've talked about regulations, the Safe Drinking Water Act. All of those regulations from both the federal and from the state level are going to be important because that's basically your target. That's what you want at the end of the day. And then the other thing that we care about here is we care about the source water type. So is it groundwater, surface water, or it falls somewhere in between at that GUDI source? So remember that GUDI stands for groundwater under the influence of surface water. So generally we have increasingly good water quality as we move from surface water to groundwater. But remember again that surface water is going to have those suspended impurities and groundwater is going to have those dissolved impurities. So sometimes the dissolved impurity is actually harder to remove. So we have good water quality, so that's important. But then the other thing that we need to think about is the number of unit processes that we have. And generally when we have groundwater, we need less treatment processes. So a surface water plant is going to be bigger. It's a harder system to deal with. So for example, the Florence Water Treatment Plant in Omaha is a surface water plant, and they have much more, they have many more unit processes, different types, as opposed to their groundwater plants in South and North Platte. So let's just take a look at what a flow diagram looks like. Every water treatment plant should have one of these. In some shape or form, they all look very different. Many times they look a lot more complicated than this. But this is an example of what we call a rapid sand filtration plant. This is very typical to be used with surface waters. So this is what we would call conventional drinking water treatment. So we start on the left side of this diagram and we move to the right. And if any of these abbreviations are confusing, there's a little key down below. You can pause the video and take a look at that. But let me grab my laser pointer. We start with the raw water on the left. And we have this thing called a BR. This is a bar rack. So this is like a pre-filtering step. It's basically just a screen. And we make sure that we catch anything we don't want. Leaves, fish, all sorts of big things that we don't want going into our system. And then we can have something called a traveling screen, which is basically the same idea, and it can move if it needs to. And then after that, we add a coagulant. So this is a chemical process. We add a coagulant to the system, and then you'll notice there's this mixing chamber right here, and that kind of looks like a CSTR, right? So that's a continuously stirred tank reactor. That's one application of those reactors that we've seen. Then it goes to a process called flocculation, where we allow that chemical to have contact with the water and we mix it up. And that flocculation little paddle that's in there generally moves pretty slow. And so the idea is to try and have some contact with the coagulant and time for those particles to agglomerate and to then move on to the next step, which is sedimentation. So this little S in this triangular basin is a sedimentation basin. So in sedimentation, we leverage gravity. So gravity is going to settle out those heavy particles, and those heavy particles get removed as sludge. We have lots of fun words in water treatment. So we have sludge, and then that has to be potentially treated, and we'll talk about that. But then the water is going to come off the top of the sedimentation basin and go to what we call a granular filter. So these filters can have things like sand and gravel and anthracite and all different types of media. But basically, any particles that didn't get settled out are going to get removed in the filter. It works much the same as water moving through the ground into a groundwater well, right? So as runoff comes down and percolates through the soil, that soil naturally filters the water. And that's the principle behind a filter. Then we generally disinfect, and chlorine is the most popular in the US and I think around the world as far as I know. There's other types of disinfection processes we can use, and we'll talk about those in class. But then that disinfected water goes to what we call a clear well. That's it's basically just a big tank where we can have contact time between that chlorine and the water to make sure it stays disinfected. And then that water gets pumped out to the distribution system using what we call a high service pump. So this is an example of kind of what a surface water treatment plant would look like. And we'll talk about each of these unit operations in detail. Each of them has a whole design process. Just to show you some different options here, this is what we call a lime softening plant. So you'll notice that many of these elements are the exact same, but we have different chemical addition. We have different pre-treatment going on. So we're specifically adding lime, we're adding a sodium carbonate, and we're trying to soften the water because this water is very hard. And so we need to be able to add these softeners prior to going through treatment. And then you'll notice there's this new step where we add carbon back into the system because we've consumed carbon up front. So very similar design of a plant, but you see different treatment processes because there's different water quality concerns and there's different treatment goals. One last example for you, this is a typical groundwater treatment plant. You'll notice that there's fewer unit operations. We don't need to treat it as much because we don't have as many suspended particles. Everything's dissolved. We have things like aeration as a pre-treatment step. And then many times groundwater systems are just disinfected and they're just chlorinated, and that's all that needs to be done in them depending on the water quality. So a very typical groundwater treatment plant is going to have fewer unit processes than a surface water plant. So to kind of sum it up here, a basic surface water treatment plant is going to have things like pre-treatment, coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation, filtration, disinfection, on-site storage in the form of a clear well, and then distribution. And then if we take a look at basic groundwater quality, it's different. There might be pre-treatment, filtration, disinfection, but there's not all of those other unit processes in between. So your source water absolutely matters, and the treatment that you need for specific contaminants is going to matter as well. And again, these are backbone diagrams just to give you an idea of what's going on in the system. All right, so let's talk about what parameters matter to an engineer, right? So we've talked about in detail water quantity and water quality, right? These are the things that we need in order to design these treatment plants. So in quantity, we need population, both current and future, and we need water demand, right? We need to know per capita usage. And so we need to know flow rates, we need to know all that good stuff. Hopefully now you can see that water quantity is a big one when it comes to choosing different treatment operations, and we'll talk about this in detail. but it often is determined by the type of source. So if we have a surface water, you'll see that we have lots of different unit processes, and that's because we have suspended things in the water, we have contaminants that we generally don't see as much in groundwater. And we often look at specific water quality parameters in both the short term and the long term in order to make decisions about what types of treatment unit processes we want. So in the short term, we generally look at turbidity. The higher the turbidity, generally the more unit processes we have. If we want to remove turbidity from the water, that's generally going to be coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation. Long term, we're going to want things like pH, color, taste, odor, hardness, alkalinity, total coliform solids, basically the whole gambit, if you can get it, of water quality parameters. The other thing that's important here, it's really important to have representative data. So we talked about this with water quantity, but it's even more critical with water quality, in my opinion, personally. You need to have samples from multiple locations at multiple times of the year because water quality changes over the year and it changes where you are. So for example, if you have a groundwater well, that water is probably pretty consistent over time in terms of its quality. But if you have a surface water lake, that's not actually true because a lake has what's called turnover, and contaminants from the bottom of the lake will rise to the surface at different times of the year. So to kind of illustrate this point, I just want to give you a quick example. So I like to give this example a lot, so forgive me if you've seen this in another class I've taught for you, but this is an example community that I worked with in Canada that has a surface water source, and unfortunately their facility was only designed based on 2 water quality samples. That's it, 2, right? That's not a lot of samples to design a water treatment plant off of. And they decided to use what's called membrane filtration. So instead of using sand as our media, we now just have membranes. It's basically a surface that has tiny little pores and you push the water through. The problem was that the samples were taken in winter for those 2 samples. And in the summer, lake has what's called turnover. So contaminants come up to the surface because the water temperature cycles within the lake. And it's beyond me to explain exactly how that occurs, but basically what you need to know is that in the summer, manganese levels in the lake rise because you have that turnover. So it actually has a lot higher manganese than people knew based on the samples. The location of the intake pipe here is shown in red, and it was too shallow, which led to a high suspended solids concentration. So you can kind of see from this picture, there's a lot of like murky, clayey soil here. You know, that's a lot looser in the summer than it is in the winter. And if you put your intake pipe deeper into the lake, you won't run into those issues with solids. And then this community in particular is what's called a First Nations community in Canada, and that means it's a native community, it's a tribal lands, and they prefer not to have chlorine in their system, so they wanted a different type of disinfection. So there are water quality issues here that weren't recognized, there's not enough data taken, and basically what the outcome of that is this. This is very dirty water. So the water that you see in the bottom right corner of the slide is water contaminated with manganese. So manganese turns your water black and brown. It's really gross. You'll see one of the samples on the left side. And you'll also see that because we based our treatment on only 2 samples, we chose membranes, but membranes do what we call fouling really quickly. So they get really dirty and they don't get backwashed. And so you'll see this is an example of the water treatment plant. It's just in complete disarray because people are trying to get the membranes to function properly and they don't work because the water quality is worse than they thought it was. They chose the wrong membranes and things just don't work. So I like to use this as an example of why having representative data is really important. Really understanding your water quality is important. All right, so that's going to conclude this pre-lecture. In class, we're going to talk about each of these unit processes in detail. So don't worry so much about understanding what coagulation is and what sedimentation is. Just kind of understand that there are differences based on the source water type, the water quality, and understand how those factors are going to play into design moving forward.